while the rest of the 17th century world lived under the boots of absolute monarchs. The most dangerous men on earth were practicing radical democracy. Forget the no rules myth. Pirate ships were governed by a strict legal contract called the Articles of Agreement. Did you know that 150 years before modern Social Security, pirates had a fixed insurance scale? Lose a right arm? That's 600 pieces of 8. Lose an eye? 100. This wasn't just a list of rules. It was a survival mechanism born in the lawless vacuum of Port Royal, the Sodom of the New World. But in 1692, the earth literally opened up and swallowed this pirate utopia in minutes. Today, we're diving into the brutal, democratic, and surprisingly sophisticated law of the lawless to see how outcasts built a functional society from blood and gold before the ocean took it all back. The story starts in 1655, not with triumph, but fallback. England's fleet sailed for Hispaniola, failed, and took Jamaica as a consolation prize. The crown accepted it. The men who stayed accepted something harder: an island with no real defenses, a garrison thinning from fever, and a Spanish empire that considered the matter unfinished. Port Royal rose on a sandbar at the tip of the Palisados, a strip barely stable enough to build on. The harbor was deep. The tar on the docks never dried in the Caribbean heat. It stayed soft on rope, on pilings, on the hands of anyone near the water. Streets weren't planned. They formed because men needed to move between ships and rum. The creak of hundreds of anchored hulls was constant. Not music, the sound of a city breathing. In London, the Admiralty filed Jamaica under strategic assets. The clerks never smelled the dockside tar. They also missed the number in the colonial dispatches. The garrison was losing roughly 20% of its men per year, not to combat, but to yellow fever. That figure didn't change the budget. Governor Thomas Modiford arrived in 1664 with orders to end privateering. He sent London reassuring dispatches. Then he looked at the math. One letter of marque cost £20 and put an armed vessel between the island and the next Spanish squadron, at no further cost to the crown. A company of Royal Infantry cost 20 times that, and London wasn't sending one. The records suggest it wasn't corruption, it was arithmetic. A Port Royal judge could sign a warrant in the morning and drink that evening with the man he'd hang, not from hypocrisy, but because both were transactions in the same economy. Not a criminal city, a rational one, where law was merchandise. On Modiford's desk, a London letter urging restraint and a stack of blank commissions. He picked up his pen. A knock. He already knew the name. Every captain in the harbor had mentioned it. Henry Morgan. Neither man knew yet what the next 8 years would cost them both. The knock at Modiford's door in 1664 started something neither man had planned. By 1668, Henry Morgan had become the most effective instrument of English colonial policy in the Caribbean, one the Crown would embrace and deny alternately, depending on which treaty it had most recently signed. The raid on Portobello began in June 1668. Morgan sailed from Port Royal with roughly 450 men in a fleet carrying no official insignia worth trusting. They rowed into the harbor at night, oars muffled, no lanterns, the jungle on both banks close enough to hear. 3 Spanish forts guarded the entrance. The garrison had received intelligence that Morgan was coming. They had not fled. They had locked the gates. What happened next is documented in the Spanish commander's report to Madrid and in depositions taken at the Admiralty 2 years later. The accounts agree on substance. Morgan used civilian prisoners, monks, nuns, elderly residents, as cover during the assault on the fortifications. He made this decision openly, in front of his full crew, as a tactical calculation. The Spanish commander fired anyway. The fort fell within hours. Morgan loaded the silver. London read the Admiralty report and sent back no censure, only a request for an accurate inventory of the captured goods. By 1669, Morgan had taken Maracaibo. By late 1671, Panama, the largest Spanish city in the Americas, was in ruins. No one knows exactly how the fire started, but the records show the city burned for 4 days. The smoke was visible from the Pacific coast. Then the documents arrived. The Madrid Treaty of 1670 had been signed while Morgan was still at sea, weeks before he approached Panama. England and Spain were officially at peace. Modiford was arrested in Port Royal and shipped to London. Morgan followed him into custody. A trial seemed certain. What came instead was a reassignment. By 1674, Henry Morgan returned to Jamaica as lieutenant governor. The man who had burned Panama now signed port regulations and issued arrest orders for men whose names he had known for years. London didn't promote him because it approved of his methods. It promoted him because it needed someone who could recognize every pirate captain in the Caribbean on sight. A sailor who survived Portobello walked away with roughly £60 sterling, 2 or 3 years' wages for a craftsman in England. Most of it was gone within a month. Port Royal extracted money as efficiently as Morgan's fleet had extracted it from Spanish ports. The loot funded the taverns. The taverns created the debts. The debts drove men back to sea. The cycle closed on itself perfectly. Morgan sat now at the lieutenant governor's desk, the same room where commissions had once been passed across to men like him. On the table, a set of pirates' articles, taken from a vessel seized that morning. He read through them slowly. Structured shares, fixed compensation for wounds, decisions made by vote. He already knew every clause by memory. He turned the last page. Nowhere on shore, no guild, no navy, no parish, offered anything close to this to an ordinary man. Morgan set the articles down. The document he'd been reading wasn't unique. Versions of it had been circulating the Caribbean for 2 decades. Copied by hand, amended by vote, signed in every port from Nassau to Tortuga. What made it unusual wasn't its content. It was the fact that it existed at all. A new crew member signed the articles at the captain's table, usually by candlelight. The text was read aloud, clause by clause, no exceptions, no adjustments for rank. Every man heard the same terms. The smell in those cabins was always the same: candle wax, damp timber, salt worked into every surface. When the reading ended, each man made his mark, a signature if he had one, a cross if he didn't. Either way, it was binding. What the articles contained would surprise anyone who assumed piracy meant the absence of rules. Gambling aboard was prohibited, not for moral reasons, but because debts between crewmates produced exactly the kind of grievance that ended with a knife. A woman could not be brought aboard without a full crew vote. The captain ate the same rations as the men. These weren't gestures of equality. They were engineering. Every clause addressed a specific failure mode that experience had identified. The compensation scale went further. Lose a right hand in action, 600 pieces of 8, or 6 months' share of future prizes. A left hand, 500. An eye, 100. Records from the Admiralty trials of 1717 to 1726 contain these exact figures, introduced by prosecutors as evidence of criminal conspiracy. The documents demonstrate something else as well. No sailor serving the Royal Navy under any commission of that period had access to anything comparable. A night watchman in Port Royal who lost a leg in a warehouse fire could expect a few shillings from the parish collection. The same man, having lost that leg during a boarding action under signed articles, walked away with 600 pieces of 8 and retained his vote at the next crew assembly. London never had to address this directly, but the labor market was watching. Quietly revised their own crew terms through the 1670s and 1680s, not from generosity, but because men were comparing terms before they signed. The articles were functioning as a market benchmark, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. The system had one structural flaw, the mirror of its strength. Decisions required a vote. In calm water, that cost nothing. In the seconds before an engagement, when course, target, and timing needed a single answer, the same process that prevented tyranny could produce paralysis. The articles accounted for this. Combat command was explicitly exempted from crew vote. One man decided, until the guns went quiet. The surgeon below deck had read these clauses more times than he could count. He'd paid out the compensations himself, counted the coins, recorded the amounts, witnessed each transaction before the crew. He also knew what no clause addressed: What happened in the hold when yellow fever came aboard? The surgeon had a system. Every morning, before the heat peaked, he walked the docks and noted who looked wrong. Skin color, gait, the particular stillness of a man fighting a temperature in a climate where standing still already cost something. He was not a physician. He was a barber surgeon from Bristol, carrying instruments he sterilized with rum, because there was nothing better available, and rum was never in short supply. After England took Jamaica in 1655, the first occupying force lost nearly half its men within months, not to Spanish resistance, to disease. The fighting was brief, the dying was not. By the time Port Royal had established itself as a working port, British garrisons on the island were losing roughly 20% of their strength per year in peacetime. That was 7 times the mortality rate recorded in Canada during the same period. Recruiters in Bristol and Plymouth had access to these numbers. They did not use them in their pitch. Yellow fever moved fast. Day 1, fever, headache, muscle pain. Day 3, a brief improvement, enough that a man might believe he'd recovered. Day 4, the relapse. Skin yellowed. Internal bleeding began. Sailors called the final symptom the black vomit, digested blood, the color of coffee grounds, which meant the end was already in progress. A surgeon could administer opium and wait. Nothing else had any documented effect. Syphilis, by contrast, was treatable. That was almost worse. The standard intervention involved mercury vapor. The patient sealed in a room with burning cinnabar, inhaling for hours at a time. Salivation increased to roughly 2 liters per day. Teeth loosened. Gums deteriorated. If the disease retreated, the treatment had worked. If the mercury destroyed the kidneys first, it had not. This was not fringe practice. This was the published medical consensus of the 17th century. An epidemic's economic damage ran ahead of its physical one. When yellow fever appeared in a harbor, the news moved between islands faster than any ship. Captains rerouted before official quarantine was declared. A port that looked half empty was already commercially dead. Creditors stopped extending terms, insurance rates in London shifted, and cargo manifests were quietly redirected to Barbados or Kingston's outer anchorage. The suffering was one event. The financial damage was a longer, quieter one. Henry Morgan died in August 1688. Gout, likely cirrhosis. His physician recommended mercury treatment. Morgan refused. He had watched enough men go through the procedure to know the range of outcomes. He chose the other option. Port Royal rang its bells. By afternoon, the docks were back to full noise. No one who replaced him knew every name in the harbor the way he had. That gap would cost the city something it couldn't yet measure. Morgan left no succession. That was the real problem. 3 governors cycled through Port Royal between 1688 and 1692, each arriving with a London mandate, each discovering the same thing. The actual machinery of the city ran on personal relationships that no appointment letter could transfer. The privateering networks Morgan had managed, through reputation, shared history, and the fact that he personally knew where every arrangement was buried, didn't collapse after his death. They became less controlled. Incidents on the streets multiplied, not because new criminals had arrived, because the one person who had known all the existing ones by name was gone, and nothing had replaced him. London was occupied elsewhere. William III had taken the throne after the Glorious Revolution, and the 9 Years' War with France began almost immediately. Caribbean dispatches arrived at the colonial office between more pressing papers and were answered with delays of several months. The colony was effectively governing itself through informal arrangements that had always been its real structure, now managed by men with less standing to enforce them. The city kept building. By 1690, Port Royal held roughly 2,000 permanent structures on a sandbar that hadn't expanded since the 1650s. New construction went onto lots where earlier buildings had settled into the ground, which no one found alarming since subsidence was part of life on the palisados. In 1690 and 1691, several merchants filed formal complaints with the governor's office. Floors in the lower districts were tilting, well water was turning brackish even in dry months. Certain streets felt unstable underfoot. The complaints were registered. The governor's office had a backlog. The corruption had also changed character. In Morgan's era, it had been directional. He decided who paid and who was protected. By 1692, it had become ambient. The Admiralty Court judge took a cut of undocumented cargo. The governors sent London dispatches describing restored order while countersigning the same arrangements that had always operated beneath the surface. Neither man saw a contradiction. The system had functioned this way long enough that it had become indistinguishable from the system. There was no deviation to correct. A blacksmith on Thames Street broke ground on a new forge in the spring of 1692, choosing a lot close to the docks for the foot traffic. The ground was soft. He laid a heavier foundation and moved on. June 7th opened like every other morning. Market at 6, harbor already in full noise, the smell of wood smoke from kitchens that had never gone cold. By 11:45, the air had gone completely still, not a breath off the water. A man on High Street checked his watch, noted the time, and kept walking. He had somewhere to be. At 11:43, the ground moved, not with a crack or a roar, with a long, slow roll, as though the harbor had shifted beneath the city's foundations. Men on the street paused, adjusted their footing, and kept walking. Then the second wave hit. The sand beneath Port Royal behaved exactly as sand saturated with seawater behaves under seismic pressure. It liquefied. Buildings didn't fall. They sank. Thames Street dropped first. The new forge, the warehouses, the lots built on fill that had never been stable, descending steadily as the ground lost its structure. People caught on those streets found themselves sinking. To the knee, to the waist, to the chest. Some stopped there, held by sand that had begun to firm around them. Heads above the surface, bodies fixed, unable to move. Survivors recorded this in depositions taken in the days that followed. It is not a literary device. It is a geological event, documented in specific detail. 2,000 people died in the first minutes. Fort Charles, built on older rock at the peninsula's edge, held. The rest of the waterfront did not. Entire blocks, walls, floors, contents, people, moved into the harbor and settled at depths of 8 to 12 feet. Within 20 minutes, a tsunami moved across what had been the merchant district, then receded, carrying wreckage into the channel. The news reached London 6 weeks later. A dispatch from the surviving colonial administrator entered the Admiralty log. The town of Port Royal wholly destroyed. The harbor compromised. Administrative relocation recommended. On the same sheet, a clerk had noted 2 other pending items. The earthquake occupied a quarter of the page. The pamphleteers moved faster. Within weeks, publications in London and Boston declared Port Royal's destruction a divine verdict, the most sinful city in the New World. Finally corrected. Among the 2,000 dead, a blacksmith, a sitting judge, a parish priest, children who had never signed anything in their lives. Liquefaction does not select by moral standing. It selects by substrate, sand or rock, nothing else. Morgan's grave slid into the sea with the eastern shoreline. He had died 4 years before the earthquake, but the water took him anyway. The contemporary chronicles note this without commentary. It sounds like a conclusion. It is only a fact. Kingston Harbor on the morning of June 8th lay flat and still. Debris on the surface, timber, canvas, a few sealed barrels. Below, streets, cookware with charred wood still in the grate. Clocks stopped at 11:43. Signed articles of men whose names no court had ever fully recorded. Sealed from air at 8 meters. Preserved in cold dark, better than anything stored in London. The sea collected what it was owed, but it kept the evidence.